Welcome to this week's episode of the Modern Mentor Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Cooke. In today's episode, I'll be sharing advice on what to do if you're finding yourself in a work slump. Because, listeners, that's where I found myself several weeks ago. And I'll be talking about the steps I personally took to reignite my work energy. I always get my ice cream in a cup, and there's a good reason for that. When I was 7, I was walking along the boardwalk with my ice cream cone, licking chocolate off the top and loving life. Then I tripped, and suddenly everything good was melting into a gooey chocolate puddle on the sidewalk. Thankfully, my dad bought me a new one, but I've never forgotten what it felt like to lose something that was bringing me joy. Have you ever had a moment like that where things went from awesome to heartbreak in a breath? It's funny that I'm thinking of this now, but something about 2020 reminded me of that day. Professionally, anyway. Things were awesome for me in February. Life was a scoop of chocolate in a cone. But by March, that sweet treat was melting all over the sidewalk, and no one was going to buy me a new one. Let me explain. Running my business has always been about being present with clients, standing at the front of a room or on a stage, facilitating education, dialogue, and shared learning experiences. But overnight, stages and rooms full of people ceased to be an option. So I started replicating my work virtually, at least to the best of my ability. But pretty quickly, I hit a slump. Work that had always lit me up was now dragging me down, and I felt uncertain and a little bit stuck. I needed a way to recharge myself, to rediscover my spark. Now it's July, and spoiler alert, I am in a much energized space. But I know from conversations I'm having daily that work slumps are on trend right now. And a slump is no laughing matter. If you try to ignore it, you'll find yourself disengaged, unproductive, uncreative, and ultimately unsuccessful. So let's talk about some strategies for pulling yourself out of a slump. I can speak to these firsthand. First, define what's changed and what you miss. If you've gone from engaged and energized to something a bit slumpier, then start by figuring out what you're missing most. For me, so much changed at once. I was suddenly no longer getting dressed for work, traveling, speaking in boardrooms, or reading body language. It felt like a million things had vanished overnight. At first, I believed I wouldn't be able to re-engage until everything felt, quote-unquote, back to normal. But when I pushed myself to reflect on what I really missed most, I discovered that for me, it wasn't about the travel, the clothes, or the room. For me, it was the feeling of regular connection that I missed. Working remotely left me with fewer organic opportunities to connect with people. That, I realized, was what I needed to bring back. If you're in a slump, what's the one thing you miss most? Learning, networking, coaching someone, checking in with customers? Do some reflecting on this. It will pay off. Next, recreate meaningful experiences. With valuable insight in my pocket, and yes, that is a metaphor, my pajamas don't have pockets, I brainstormed ways to recreate connection. Prior to the pandemic, I was either working from home, focusing on researching, designing, and preparing workshops, or I was on site with a client to coach or deliver a program. I never worried about creating connections when I was working remotely because my client experiences filled that bucket for me. So now that all of my work is remote for the time being, I've created a discipline around connecting with people, either personally or professionally. Each morning in my bullet journal, I capture the name of one person I'll reach out to that day. I find that even just leaving someone a voicemail can be enough to recharge my connection battery. Creating this discipline has paid off for me. What's something you can do to recreate whatever you're missing? If it's networking, can you start a conversation on LinkedIn? If it's visiting customers, can you plan to call one each day? Get as close as you can to the real thing. Next, experiment with new ways of doing things. Sometimes the best way to climb out of a slump is to get a little crafty. As we've already established, a scoop of chocolate ice cream will always make me smile. But every now and then, a dose of rum raisin or pistachio can be pretty darn rejuvenating. Sometimes pulling yourself out of a slump is about breaking with comfort and routine and leaning into something new, just because. For me, I was used to facilitating full-day meetings and programs. Can you imagine a fate worse than participating in a full-day anything on Zoom? Ugh. The old way wasn't going to work for me. I had to experiment. I talk about this in a video about career anxiety I posted recently on the Modern Mentor podcast page on LinkedIn. I started breaking full-day programs into shorter chunks. I would facilitate a virtual 90-minute session that was part education and part participant action planning. Participants would then execute their action plan and we would talk about it in our next 90-minute session. It's a totally different way of facilitating, but I'm finding in some cases the impact for the client is even greater than it was before. I'm excited about this new way of working. And when the world does reopen, I'll still offer clients this means of delivery because it works. Is there one tiny thing you can switch up today just to see how it feels? Next, take a breather. One of the most common causes of the slump is battery drain. Overwork, anxiety, trying to be all things to all people at the same time. These are part of our current reality, and they're not serving us. I realize in hindsight that trying to figure out how to work in new ways while homeschooling my kids and becoming an armchair epidemiologist was absolutely exhausting. I was running on fumes. So I started taking regular walks. 2 or 3 times a day, I would pop outside and just walk around the block. I'd listen to pods or music or call a friend. But the break from everything was what my mind and body needed. What's something you can do for yourself in small doses that will pay off in recharging you? And finally, talk someone else out of a slump. You won't have to look far to find someone else struggling with a rut. Maybe counterintuitively, helping them out of theirs can actually bump you out of yours. A friend of mine was struggling with what she described as her mountain of Zoom. She was spending entire days in one chair, dialing into back-to-back video calls. She was exhausted and bored, and definitely in a slump of her own. I asked her to look at the last 5 days on her calendar. How many meetings did you attend? I asked her. And how many of those really required or benefited from you being there? Her answers were 36 attended, 11 necessary. Oof. She was totally drained from meeting overload, combined with stress over her work not getting done. Attending meetings had become her full-time job. So we talked through a plan that would help her make better decisions and take control over her calendar. And through my conversation with her, I realized that I too was over-investing in things that depleted my energy. I took some of my own advice, and by doing so, I rediscovered my creativity, which helped me think through experimentation. And there you have it, the roadmap that led me from Slumptown to Fired Upville. If you're struggling with a work slump of your own, please recognize it may take time to climb out. Be patient with yourself. Know that slumps are normal. It will pass. And until it does, take care of yourself. I hope these tips were helpful. Do you have a question I can answer? Send it my way. Check out all the links in my bio for the ways you can reach me. You can also visit my website at leadabovenoise.com or follow me on the Modern Mentor podcast page on LinkedIn. Join me next week for an episode about how to build a secret circle of mentors. Until then, thanks so much for listening and have a successful week.